Hello, thank you for joining us. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email him directly with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. Right, this is just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C.-based firm and provide services to federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. The information is on our website, so please visit us there. We do offer advertising in our newsletter, so please feel free to reach out to this email if you'd like more information on that. All right, our speaker today is Ed Delisle, and he's going to be going over Simplified Acquisitions, a Beginner's Guide. Thank you for joining us today, Ed. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Mallory, welcome everyone. Today we will in fact be talking about simplified acquisitions, and we'll be talking about it from the standpoint of beginners, for those who are looking to learn a little bit about what the simplified acquisition process is and a little bit about how it works. So by virtue of its name, the idea behind simplified acquisitions is to make purchases less complicated than they would otherwise be for a federal agency, as well as for those that are selling to those federal agencies. We'll talk a little bit during our discussion today about how the simplified acquisition process has changed over time, but let's start with what it is. A simplified acquisition is a purchase by a government agency which does not exceed the simplified acquisition threshold, also known as SAT, S-A-T. Now, if you can advance the slide for me. I'm sorry, one more. Sorry about that. Okay, so what is the SAT, the Simplified Acquisition Threshold? So we're talking about purchases that are made up to the financial ceiling, which represents the SAT. Currently, if you were to look in the FAR for the Simplified Acquisition Threshold, you'll see a financial ceiling of $150,000. That's in FAR Part 13, which we'll talk about briefly. That number, however, is subject to change based upon the National Defense Authorization Acts of 2017, and then in 2018, Congress asked for the SAT to change from $150,000 to $250,000. And the micro purchase threshold, which you see represented as $3,500 on the slide, will be raised to $10,000. There was a proposed rule that was issued on October 2, 2019, raising those levels to what you see here. And the comment for the proposed rules, the comments closed on December the 2nd. So at some point in the first quarter of the new year, you'll see these proposed rules become final, and you'll find them represented in FAR Part 13. So while the new thresholds appear new and not yet in place, in fact, way back in February of 18, based upon the National Defense Authorization Act, these thresholds started being used based upon deviations to the FAR. The first was initiated by the Civilian Agency Acquisition Council, which then prompted GSA in March of 2018 to start using these higher thresholds, and the Department of Defense started doing the same thing based upon a deviation in the fall of 2018. So while the new thresholds appear to be new, they've been used for quite some time, for the last year or so by most agencies. And what does it all mean? One of the reasons why the threshold was raised from 150 to 250 was to allow contracting officers more flexibility in purchasing small dollar value items and services. And the estimates that were identified in the basis for raising the rule indicated that hundreds of millions of additional dollars would be spent by government agencies using simplified acquisition procedures between 2015 and 2018 had the levels been raised up until that point. So there is an anticipation that the heightening of the threshold levels will have quite an impact in terms of dollars spent Mallory, if you could advance the slide. So very quickly, how did we get to where we are in terms of the use of simplified acquisition procedures, and why are they being used the way that they're being used today? Well, we can start by looking at the Competition and Contracting Act of 1984. It was implemented for the purpose of promoting competition in federal procurement, and it forms the basis of what you'll see now in FAR Part 6 relating to competition, and generally stands for the notion that competition is a good thing. The theory was, and still generally is, that more competition reduces cost, and the thought back at that time was that more competition was good for small business. Smaller companies with lower overheads would be able to compete on a basis that was more fair and equitable to them. Over the course of time, it became generally recognized that the procurement process had become overly complex and burdensome. For example, for many competitive procurements going back, to the early 80s, certified cost and pricing data was required, and again, this was just for just about everything. And for smaller companies in particular, providing that information was burdensome, complicated, expensive, and that's just simply one example of how difficult navigating the procurement system had become. So in 1994, we saw the passage of the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, and FASA was introduced to make things easier, especially when it comes to smaller purchases, which is what we're talking about today. It was designed specifically to increase the use of simplified acquisition procedures and to make things cheaper and easier to compete and eliminate some of the administrative burden on both government and contractor. Mallory, can you advance the slide? So why does the government use them? For some of the reasons that we've already identified. It reduces the government's administrative costs in terms of making purchases. It eliminates more extensive market research that the government would otherwise have to perform before engaging in a procurement. There are less requirements to the government in terms of the selection process that it must incorporate, and there's broader discretion involved in terms of making a selection. It's also designed to promote efficiency and avoid unnecessary burdens with respect to the contractors that are interested in performing for the government. There aren't nearly as many contractual clauses and requirements as you'd find in a typical, say, FAR Part 15 negotiated procurement or other contracts that are issued through more complicated procurement means. And it also is designed to improve opportunities for small businesses, which was one of the points in the passage of FASA, which we just discussed. And in that respect, it also helps government in terms of meeting its small business goals, which it seems to be, based upon recent history, attaining each and every year. Why does it help improve opportunities for small business specifically? Mallory, if you can advance the slide. Using SAP or Simplified Acquisition Procedures does that because as set forth in the Federal Acquisition Requisition, anything between the micro purchase level, which is that $10,000 level that we discussed, and the simplified acquisition threshold, which will soon be the $250,000 that we discussed, those contractual opportunities are exclusively reserved for small business. They are generally competitive, and they are reserved and set aside for small business. And when we're talking about small business, we're talking about small business of all types. We're talking about service disabled, veteran owned. We're talking about WOSBs, hub zones, straight small business, all of which are identified in FAR Part 19, which is also referenced in FAR Part 13, which relates to the use of simplified acquisition procedures. So it's a win-win for small business if the type of goods and services that you provide fall within this particular monetary range. Okay, if we can advance the slide. So we mentioned FAR Part 13 a few moments ago. That's where you'll find information on the government's use and ability to use the simplified acquisition procedures. I've identified a few of the provisions here. The one that I think would be most beneficial to folks that are listening here who might be more beginners is the first one, 13.000-0006. That relates to the purpose and policy behind SAP. It's the least technical of the procedures that are in this particular FAR section, and it provides a general overview of everything else that you'll find within FAR Part 13. So most of what you'll need to understand from a beginner's perspective, you can find in that part of FAR Part 13, and I recommend that folks read through that. There are a few other sections that I don't mention here. FAR 13.2 relates to what happens below the micro purchase level, which will soon officially be $10,000. And for the most part, most agencies are using $10,000 at this point. Much less competition below that threshold level. That's FAR 13.2. FAR 13.4 relates to fast payment procedures, which typically relate to payment before goods and services are provided. And then FAR 13.5 relates to simplified acquisition procedures specifically for commercial items where the threshold levels are a little bit higher. If you're talking about commercial items, the threshold level is 7 million, and these are items that can be typically found in the marketplace and can be purchased in bulk. And if the commercial items that you're talking about are being provided in a contingency as part of a contingency operation in response to a terrorist act or something like that, the threshold level it rises up from 7 million to 13 million. If we can advance the slide. All right, so what are the simplified acquisition procedures? And people hate when I say this, but it sort of depends. Before we talk about what procedures can be used generally, let's talk about what the FAR indicates a contracting officer has to do when employing SAP. The contracting officer must assure that he or she does not buy more than the government needs and attempts to get the best price. It's okay to buy in bulk. It's not okay to buy in bulk if it's to an unreasonable extent. Okay, and as far as price is concerned, that's most important, and that's really when it comes to simplified acquisition procedures. That's the one thing from a contracting officer standpoint that they really have to document, and we'll talk about documentation briefly. Also, a contracting officer must satisfy FAR 19.6 as to small business if it decides that it wants to eliminate a small business that has made an offer or submitted a bid to the government under these procedures. What does that mean? That means that if a contracting officer wants to eliminate a small business for not being responsible, then it must seek the advice of the Small Business Administration prior to eliminating that small business from the ability to compete. Contracting officer, when using SAP, must also provide for inspection of supply and services as part of the solicitation that it issues under FAR Part 13. Okay, if we can advance the slide. Okay, what must a contracting officer not do as part of the simplified acquisition procedures process? He or she cannot solicit quotes or ask for proposals based upon personal preference. So if, for example, a contracting officer only likes Bounty paper towels, that is not a sufficient reason to ask for Bounty paper towels as part of a solicitation for those goods. Personal preference can't come into play. The more important thing in terms of using the SAP procedures is to promote competition to the maximum extent practicable, which you see here. That's the reason, or at least part of the reason, why personal preference is not something that is permissible under FAR Part 13. And for the same reason, restricting a solicitation to well-known or widely distributed makes or brands, paper towels, for example, is not permissible generally under FAR Part 13 because, again, using Bounty as an example, I love Bounty, nothing against Bounty, but if there is a cheaper alternative out there and you're going to get the same good for all intents and purposes, then the contracting officer is obligated to try to do that. All right, if we can advance the slide. We talked about the promotion of competition to the maximum extent practicable. How does a contracting officer do that in connection with these procedures? Well, it uses SAM, first and foremost, as its primary place of determining whether or not there will be competition for the goods and services that he or she desires. Okay, so for all small businesses out there, you need to make sure that your representations and certifications in SAM are accurate and up to date, so that if a contracting officer looks to see what contractors might be available to provide a good or a service, that your profile is accurate. They can also use any other information that the agency that the contracting officer works for might have available relative to the good or service that it is procuring. So this sort of allows the contracting officer to understand sort of what was delivered previously, at what price, and by whom. And it would also potentially allow the contracting officer to reach out to that particular contractor to find out if it is still providing the good or service that the contracting officer is seeking, and that in doing that, it assists in the limited marketing research that the contracting officer is required to do as part of this process. If what it's buying is in excess of $25,000, the contracting officer will provide synopses of that intended purchase, and it's supposed to do that through what's called the government point of entry, the GPE, which for many years was FBO, Federal Business Opportunities, and is now the System for Award Management, or SAM. Okay, if we can advance the slide. Okay, still on promoting competition, under FAR Part 13, regarding simplified acquisition procedures, contracting officers are encouraged to use the best value selection process, or a best value selection process. Best value is more typically used under FAR Part 15. That means things like, have you done it before, experience, how well have you done it, past performance, who's going to do it, management, so identifying management personnel, and sometimes, how fast can you do it, schedule. So under FAR Part 13, contracting officers are encouraged to use some sort of process like that. I can tell you many times that's not the case, and we'll talk about that briefly, but if they do use a process like this, it's typically some sort of past performance, the requirement that a contractor identify whether it's done a particular service previously for the government, or provided a particular good that the government is looking for previously, and at what, how well has it been done, and at what price. Generally speaking, that's the extent of any best value conducted under FAR Part 13. And if it is used, it doesn't have to be consistent with FAR Part 15. So all of the requirements under FAR Part 15, which is negotiated procurement, sort of fall by the wayside. There doesn't have to be discussions with any of the offerors. There doesn't have to be a competitive range established. There isn't a requirement for a debriefing after the fact. None of those things will apply, and they don't have to tell you, by the way, the importance of any factor or sub-factor identified in the solicitation again, under FAR Part 15. Normally, what will happen as part of the simplified acquisition procedures, the government will issue an RFQ, a request for quote, and the prospective vendor will respond with a price. Okay. Then, once that price is submitted, the government will make an offer. Typically, that's either through a purchase order or a blanket purchase agreement. And if that's accepted, then you have a binding agreement with the government, and you can go about your way. That's very different than an RFP process. If most people are accustomed to RFPs, once a response or a proposal is made in response to one, if the government accepts that, you're making the offer, and if the government accepts it, you have a contract. This is a little bit different. This process is a little bit different than what's typical. If the government under SAP decides to use the RFP process, all of those things that would otherwise come into play, as I discussed, don't come into play here. The only thing that they really have to do after the fact is provide a brief explanation of why they selected one company versus another. There's not going to be much in the way of documentation that's kept or required to be kept as part of the contracting officer's file, and there aren't very much in terms of requirements placed on the contractor or prospective contractors, in terms of submitting information. So there's not going to be a heck of a lot there in terms of the ability to kind of challenge the award thereafter. So from a protest perspective, which is, sometimes what I get calls about, it's difficult. It's very difficult. But the procedures themselves are great for small business to consider. And Mallory, if you can advance the slide. Because if you are a small business, you have a lower investment, and that's one of the biggest factors in terms of why you should consider participating in the SAP process. If what you provide, if the good or service that you provide can be provided within the financial thresholds that we've talked about here today, the cost to bid or submit a proposal is much less than it otherwise would be. You don't need a proposal team to make an offer to the government or to respond to an RFQ. And if you can get a foot in the door, which this in part can help you do, it can assist in building a relationship with an agency. I have a client who did a small job at the Pentagon a number of years ago, and through that very small job, it was able to develop a relationship with the folks at the Pentagon, and in addition to other contractors who were working there. And that initial contract, which again it obtained through the simplified acquisition procedures, it was able to obtain multiple contracts thereafter. Some which were through FAR Part 15, some which were through FAR Part 13. And it was also able to obtain subcontracts through some of the other large business concerns that it met, based upon the relationships that all started with that initial contract it was awarded through the simplified acquisition procedures. So it's a great first step in building relationships both with the agency and with other contractors that may be working in the facility, if it's a service, that you may be working in. So it's a great way to get a foot in the door. It's the cost of entry is low, so it can be a win-win for small business. So that's all I have for now. For anybody who's interested, we'll be talking about simplified acquisition procedures in about 5 minutes or so, and we're going to get into some additional details about it. So, dial back in if you have an interest. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Ed, for joining us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to him at the email or phone number shown on your screen. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you.